In this video, we're going to analyze how supply shocks affect macroeconomic equilibrium. So we have our axis already drawn with our price level as our y-axis and real GDP as our x-axis. Now all we need to do is draw our downward sloping aggregate demand curve, label that AD0, and now an upward sloping AS curve, AS0, and again, where they intersect is simply what our equilibrium level of real GDP is, Y0, as well as our equilibrium level of equilibrium price level, which we're going to denote P0. So the first scenario we're going to look at is going to be a positive aggregate supply shock. Alright, so positive aggregate supply shock is going to be denoted by this outward shift of aggregate supply. We're going to call it AS1. And now our new equilibrium is going to be found by seeing where this new aggregate supply curve intercepts with the original aggregate demand curve. So that's going to be at this point here. If we go down, we can get our real GDP after this aggregate supply shock. And if we go across, we can get our new equilibrium price level after this supply shock. So we can see two things happen. The first thing is our real GDP increased. So we see an increase in real GDP. We see a decrease in the price level. Now we can perform a similar analysis when there is a negative aggregate supply shock. So let's just scroll down. We'll get our axes set up again. Again, on the y-axis we have the price level, on the x-axis we have real GDP. We're just going to have our downward sloping aggregate demand curve, AD0. We have our original aggregate supply curve, AS0. The equilibrium is where they both meet. We can go down to get our equilibrium real GDP, and across to get our original equilibrium price level. Okay, so now we have another scenario, but here we have a negative aggregate supply shock. So negative, of course, means it's going to have a negative effect on real GDP. So let's just change our color again back to red. And what that's going to look like is this shift to the left of the AS curve. So now where the new curve intercepts the old AD curve, we have our equilibrium point. Again, we go down to get our new equilibrium for real GDP, and across to see our new equilibrium for the price level. So we can again notice two things happen. We have a fall in real GDP due to this negative AS shock, and we have a rise in the price level. So a fall in real GDP and a rise in price level. So we've covered both possibilities of shifts in the AS curve. We've looked at a positive AS shock, and we see there's an increase in real GDP and a decrease in the price level. And if there's a negative AS shock, it's the opposite. There's a fall in real GDP and a rise in the price level. So if we remember from our aggregate demand video, aggregate demand shock video, both price level and real GDP move in the same direction, whereas if we have an aggregate supply shock, they move in opposite directions.